Hannah McDonald. I'm with the Alliance Française de Chicago, and today I will be reading Part 2, Chapter 4 from Bonjour Tristesse by Françoise Sagan. My father had displayed no emotion other than astonishment. The maid had explained to him that Elsa had come to fetch her suitcase and had left again immediately. I don't know why she didn't mention our conversation to him. She was a local woman with a very romantic outlook on life, and she must have thought our situation quite spicy, especially with the change to the bedroom arrangements that she had had to deal with. Anyway, my father and Anne, being racked with remorse, showed me every consideration and a kindness which, although at first was unbearable, I quickly learned to appreciate. The fact was that, even though it was all my doing, I did not find it very pleasant to always be running into Cyril and Elsa arm in arm, showing every sign of being in perfect harmony. I could no longer go sailing, but I could see Elsa sailing past with her hair all windswept, as mine had been. I had no difficulty in assuming an impassive and deceptively detached expression when we met them, for we met them everywhere, in the wood, in the village, on the road. Anne would glance at me and talk to me about something else. She would put her hand on my shoulder to comfort me. Have I said that she was kind? I don't know whether her kindness was a refined expression of her intelligence or quite simply of her aloofness, but she always had the right word or gesture, and if there had been any real suffering involved, I could not have had better support. So I let myself drift on without too much concern, for, as I've said, my father was showing no sign of jealousy. That was proof to me of his attachment to Anne, and it annoyed me somewhat because it also showed up the futility of my plans. One day we were going to the post office, he and I, when we passed Elsa. She appeared not to see us, and my father turned round to look at her, giving a little whistle as if she were someone he didn't know. I say, she's gotten terribly attractive looking, has Elsa. Love suits her, I said. He looked at me in surprise. You seem to be taking that better than before. What do you expect, I said. They're the same age, so it was more or less inevitable. If it hadn't been for Anne, it wouldn't have been at all inevitable. He was furious. Don't imagine that some cheeky young devil could take away a woman from me if I didn't consent to it. Age does come into it, I said solemnly. He shrugged his shoulders. When we got back, I saw that he was preoccupied. Perhaps he was thinking that yes, Elsa was young and so was Cyril, and that marrying a woman of his own age meant that he would no longer fall into the category of men who were ageless. I couldn't help feeling triumphant. When I saw the little wrinkles in the corners of Anne's eyes and the slight creasing round her mouth, I did feel angry with myself, but it was so easy to follow my impulses and to repent later. A week went by. Cyril and Elsa, who did not know how matters were progressing, must have been expecting me every day, but I didn't dare go to see them. They would have forced me to come up with more ideas, and I wasn't keen on that. In any case, in the afternoons I was going up to my room, supposedly to work. In point of fact, I was doing nothing. I had found a book on yoga, and I was getting down to that with great conviction, sometimes succumbing to the most awful fits of giggles, but silently because I was afraid that Anne might hear. In fact, I told her that I was working very hard. I pretended for her benefit to be disappointed in love and to be finding consolation in the thought of one day becoming an accomplished graduate. I got the impression that she thought well of me and that I took to quoting Kant at mealtimes, which quite clearly dismayed my father. One afternoon, I had swathed myself in bath towels in order to achieve a more Hindu look. I had placed my right foot on my left thigh and was staring at myself in the mirror, not in a self-satisfied way, but in the hope of attaining the higher state of the yogi, when there was a knock at the door. I assumed it was the maid, and as nothing ever alarmed her, I called to her to come in. It was Anne. She stood stock still for a moment in the doorway, and then she smiled. What do you think you're playing at? At yoga, I said, but I'm not playing. It's a Hindu philosophy. She went over to the table and picked up my book. I began to get alarmed. It was open to page 100, and the other pages were covered with notes in my handwriting, such as, can't be done, or exhausting. You are very conscientious, she said. And what has become of this great Essay on Pascal that you've talked to us so much about? It was true that I had enjoyed holding forth at mealtimes on something Pascal says that I pretended to have thought about and worked on. I hadn't written a word, of course. I stayed perfectly still. Anne looked at me intently, and the truth suddenly dawned on her. It's your own business if you don't work and if you play the fool in front of the mirror, she said. But if you then take delight in lying to your father and me, that's more serious. I must say your sudden burst of intellectual activity did surprise me. She made her exit, leaving me petrified in my bath towels. I didn't understand her reference to lies. I had talked about essays to please her, yet out of the blue she was heaping scorn on me. I had become accustomed to her new attitude towards me, and now the calm, humiliating nature of her disdain filled me with rage. I got out of my attire, pulled on trousers and an old blouse, and rushed from the house. The heat was overpowering, but I began to run, propelled by a kind of fury that was all the more violent for my suspecting that I was ashamed. I ran all the way to Cyril's, and I stopped, breathless, at the entrance to his villa. In the afternoon heat, the houses seemed strangely deep, silent, and turned in on their secrets. I went up to Cyril's bedroom, which he had shown me the day we had gone to see his mother. I opened the door. He was asleep, stretched out across his bed with his cheek resting on his arm. I stood looking at him for a full minute. For the first time ever, he appeared defenseless to me, a touching sight. I called out to him in a low voice. He opened his eyes and, on seeing me, sat up immediately. "Is it you? Why are you here?" I signaled to him not to speak so loud. If his mother were to come up and find me in her son's room, she might think, and who wouldn't think? Panic seized me, and I made for the door. "Where are you going?" cried Cyril. "Come back, Cecile." He had caught me by the arm and was laughingly holding me back. I turned towards him and looked at him. He went pale, as I myself must have been pale, and he let go of my wrist, but only to take me in his arms and carry me along with him. In my confusion, I kept thinking that this had been bound to happen. And then began love's merry dance, where fear goes hand in hand with desire, and where, too, there is tenderness and rage, and that brutal hurt giving way to the triumph of pleasure. With Cyril's greatness playing its part, I had the good fortune to discover it that day. I stayed close to him for an hour, dazed and amazed. I had always heard love being spoken of as something quite straightforward. I had myself spoken of it crudely, with the ignorance of youth, but it seemed to me now that I would never again be able to speak of it in that way, in that detached and coarse manner. Cyril, lying beside me, was talking about marrying me and having me next to him for as long as he lived. My silence worried him. I sat up and looked at him and called him my lover. He leaned forward. I pressed my mouth on the vein that was still throbbing in his neck, murmuring, "My darling, Cyril, my darling." I don't know if it was true love that I felt for him at that moment. I have always been fickle, and I don't believe in seeing myself as anything other than what I am. But at that moment, I loved him more than I loved myself. I would have given my life for him. He asked me as I was leaving if I felt reproachful toward him, which made me laugh. How could I feel reproachful toward him for giving me such happiness? I made my way slowly back through the pines, exhausted and numbed. I had asked Cyril not to come with me. It would have been too dangerous. I was afraid that the blatant hallmarks of pleasure might be legible on my face, in the shadows under my eyes, in the fullness of my lips, and in my trembling. Anne was on a recliner in front of the house, reading. I had a good story ready to explain my absence, but she asked me no questions. She never asked me any questions. So I sat down near her without saying anything, remembering that we had fallen out. I stayed motionless with my eyes half closed, attentive to the rhythm of my breathing and the quivering of my fingers. From time to time, the memory of Cyril's body, as it had been at certain moments, left me feeling drained. I took a cigarette from the table and struck a match on the matchbox. It went out. I lit a second one carefully, for there was no wind and the only thing quivering was my hand. It went out as soon as it touched my cigarette. I groaned and took a third one. And then, I don't know why, that match became of vital importance to me. Perhaps it was because Anne, suddenly no longer aloof, was watching me intently and with no hint of a smile. At that moment, time and our surroundings vanished, and all that remained was the match with my finger on it, the gray matchbox, and Anne's gaze. My mind went into a spin, and my heart began to beat furiously. I tightened my fingers around the match. It flared, and while I was eagerly bending my face forward towards it, my cigarette caught the tip of it and put it out. I let the box fall to the ground and closed my eyes. Anne's harsh, interrogating gaze was bearing down on me. All that I prayed for, and from whatever quarter, was that the waiting should be over. Anne took my face in her hands while I kept my eyelids tight shut for fear she might see the look in my eyes. I could feel tears oozing out, tears of exhaustion, embarrassment, and pleasure. At that point, as if she were foregoing any attempt to question me, in a gesture of appeasement which seemed to convey that she suspected nothing, Anne ran her hands down my face and released me. Then she put a lighted cigarette into my mouth and immersed herself in her book again. I have imposed a certain meaning on that gesture of hers, or I have tried to. But today, whenever I need a match, I come back to that strange moment and to the gap between myself and what I was trying to do, to Anne's gaze weighing on me, and to that emptiness all around, the intensity of the void. That's all for today. Thank you.